In the year 711, the Iberian Peninsula was a cauldron of tensions, a place where the Visigothic kingdom teetered like an old building in the midst of a political earthquake. It was hardly the scene of a united and prosperous realm, but rather a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit, each pulling in a different direction. To understand how an army of Berbers and Arabs, led by the shrewd Tariq ibn Ziyad, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and planted the seeds of what would become Al-Andalus, you need to dive into the thicket of details. This isn't just the story of an invasion, it's a tale of unchecked ambitions, betrayals that would make a palace intrigue screenwriter blush, battles where luck played as much a role as strategy, and a Visigothic kingdom that seemed hell-bent on self-destruction. So, grab a tea or coffee, because we're going to break down the year 711 as if we were dismantling a medieval engine, piece by piece. The Visigothic kingdom, which had dominated the Iberian Peninsula since the late 5th century, was not at its finest hour. The Visigoths, a Germanic people who had burst into the Roman Empire like an unwelcome guest, had settled in Hispania after an agreement with Rome in 418. Over time, they built a kingdom that spanned nearly the entire peninsula and parts of what is now southern France, with Toledo as its political and religious heart. Their conversion to Catholicism in 587 under King Rodrigo had given the kingdom some cohesion, but by 711, that unity was a distant memory. The kingdom was fractured by internal struggles, rivalries among nobles, and an economy that was far from thriving. Picture a ship with too many captains, each shouting contradictory orders as the waves close in. The Visigothic political system was, to put it kindly, organized chaos. Kings didn't inherit the throne by birthright but were elected by an assembly of nobles and bishops, turning every succession into a medieval reality show. Since Rodrigo's death, Visigothic kings had a political lifespan shorter than a Snapchat message. Assassinations, dethronements, and conspiracies were so common you'd wonder how they kept the kingdom standing for 2 centuries. Visigothic laws, codified in the Liber Iudiciarum, tried to impose order, but in practice, nobles did whatever suited them. Aristocratic families, like those descended from Chindaswinth or Wamba, vied for power, and each new king was an opportunity to settle scores or gain influence. In 710, the death of King Witiza was like tossing a match into a powder keg. Witiza had ruled since 702, and while later Christian chronicles paint him as a weak and corrupt ruler, that might be propaganda from his rivals. The truth is his reign wasn't a total disaster. He kept the Basques in the north at bay and strengthened control over southern provinces like Beetica. But his death left a vacuum no one could fill without a fight. His sons, likely led by Aguila II, expected to inherit the throne, but the nobility had other plans. In an assembly, possibly in Toledo, they chose Rodrigo, known as Don Rodrigo, a noble with military experience who had led campaigns against northern rebels. Rodrigo wasn't a nobody, but he wasn't a consensus candidate either. His coronation, far from uniting the kingdom, opened a rift that the Muslims would soon exploit. The division in the Visigothic kingdom wasn't just political but also social and geographic. The Iberian Peninsula was a mosaic of cultures and regions. In the north, Basques and Cantabrians lived in a sort of belligerent autonomy, resisting Visigothic attempts to impose taxes or laws. In the south, ancient Roman cities like Córdoba, Seville, and Merida housed a diverse population of Hispano-Romans, Jews, and Visigoths. Hispano-Romans, descendants of the Roman Empire's inhabitants, were the majority but subordinate to the Visigothic elite. Jews, persecuted under Visigothic laws that forced conversion or exile, lived in precarious tolerance. This diversity, which could have been a strength, became a weakness when nobles prioritized local interests over kingdom-wide unity. While the Visigoths were busy with their internal dramas, across the Strait of Gibraltar in North Africa, the Umayyad Empire was at its zenith. The Umayyads, who had seized control of the Caliphate in 661 after a period of civil wars in the Islamic world, were a dynasty with a knack for conquest. Their empire stretched from the Indus to the Atlantic, and their military machine was a blend of Arab discipline and Berber zeal. In the Maghrib, Governor Musa ibn Nusair was tasked with keeping order in a region that was anything but a stable paradise. The Berbers, a collection of warrior tribes with a long tradition of resistance, had been subdued in the late 7th century, but their conversion to Islam was more nominal than heartfelt. Many accepted the new faith out of pragmatism but remained fiercely independent. Musa, a cunning administrator with a nose for opportunity, knew governing the Berbers was like trying to tame a lion with a wooden chair. His solution was to channel their bellicose energy toward a common goal: conquest. By 710, Musa had consolidated control over the Maghreb, from Tunis to Tangier, and had a mixed army of Arabs and Berbers ready for action. The Iberian Peninsula, just across the strait, wasn't an unknown target. Muslims already had information about Hispania, thanks to merchants, spies, and likely Visigothic deserters. Chronicles mention an exploratory raid in 710, led by Tariq ibn Malik, who landed with a few hundred men in the peninsula's south and returned with detailed reports. It was like sending a drone to map the terrain, but with sandals and swords. Enter a figure whom Christian chronicles have turned into the perfect scapegoat: Count Julian. Julian, possibly the governor of Ceuta, a strategic outpost that had been the last Byzantine stronghold in North Africa, is a character shrouded in legend. According to Christian chronicles, especially those written centuries later like the Mozarabic Chronicle or the Chronicle of Alfonso III, Julian had a daughter named Florinda, nicknamed La Cava. The story, which sounds like a medieval soap opera, claims Florinda was sent to Rodrigo's court in Toledo, where the king, in a moment of questionable morality, seduced or assaulted her. Julian, blinded by rage, swore revenge and contacted Musa, offering ships, guides, and all the information needed to invade Hispania. Arab chronicles, less prone to melodrama, simply describe Julian as an ally who facilitated the crossing, possibly for political or economic reasons. The Florinda story is likely a later invention, crafted to add a touch of personal tragedy to the Visigothic kingdom's fall. In the 8th century, political alliances were more common than romantic vendettas, and it's more probable that Julian saw the Muslims as a chance to weaken Rodrigo and bolster his own position. Ceuta, sitting just across the strait, was a key logistical point. Controlling its walls and port meant controlling access to the peninsula, and Julian, whether out of spite or pragmatism, provided the means for Musa's army to cross the water. Without his help, the invasion might have remained a wild idea filed away in Musa's crazy plans folder. The true protagonist of the invasion was Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber convert to Islam who served as Musa's lieutenant. Tariq was no armchair general. He was a charismatic leader with combat experience, likely hardened in campaigns against Maghreb Berber tribes. In the spring of 711, he assembled an army of about 7,000 men, mostly Berbers with a small Arab contingent, and prepared to cross the strait. The logistics of this operation were no small feat. The Strait of Gibraltar, though only 14 kilometers wide at its narrowest, could be treacherous, with strong currents and unpredictable winds. The ships, likely a mix of requisitioned merchant and fishing vessels, were hardly modern warships. Moving thousands of men, along with weapons, supplies, and horses, required meticulous planning and, probably, a bit of faith that the weather wouldn't turn against them. The landing took place on a rocky promontory we now know as Gibraltar, a name derived from Jabal Tariq, or Tariq's Mountain. The choice of this site wasn't random. Gibraltar offered an elevated position, ideal for setting up a defensive camp and keeping watch over the surroundings. It was also near Algeciras, a port that facilitated supply lines. Picture the scene: thousands of Berber soldiers, many likely seasick from the journey, stepping onto Iberian soil for the first time. There was no welcome committee, just an unfamiliar landscape and the certainty that they were about to face a far larger enemy. Arab chronicles, always with a touch of epic flair, claim Tariq gave a speech that would have inspired anyone. Legend has it he ordered the ships burned to eliminate any chance of retreat, then said something like, "Before you lies the enemy, behind you the sea. Only victory or death awaits." It's a cinematic image, but in reality, burning the ships would have been a huge logistical risk. More likely, Tariq, a practical leader, secured supply lines and organized his men for the advance. While Tariq consolidated his position in Gibraltar, news of the invasion took time to reach Rodrigo. In 711, communications relied on horseback messengers, who could take days to cross the peninsula, assuming they weren't lost or ambushed by bandits. Rodrigo was in the north, possibly campaigning against the Basques, who remained a thorn in the Visigoths' side. When he finally learned that a Muslim army had landed in the south, he gathered an army that, according to sources, was much larger than Tariq's. Estimates vary wildly. Some chronicles claim 30,000 men, others 100,000, likely an exaggeration to make the Visigothic defeat more tragic. In reality, Rodrigo's army was large but composed of contingents loyal to different nobles, many of whom didn't see Rodrigo as their legitimate king. Loyalty was the Visigoths' Achilles' heel. Supporters of Witiza's sons, like brothers Appas and Sispert, were ready to switch sides if the situation called for it. The Visigothic army wasn't a unified force but a coalition of interests that crumbled under pressure. In contrast, Tariq's army, though smaller, was bound by a common goal: conquest and plunder. The Berbers, many newly converted to Islam, fought with a mix of religious fervor and material ambition, while the Arabs in command brought tactical expertise. This blend of discipline and motivation would prove key in the battle to come. The Battle of Guadalete, fought in July 711, is the climax of this story. The exact location remains a puzzle for historians, who debate whether it was near the Janda lagoon, Medina Sidonia, or elsewhere in the south. Chronicles aren't much help, as in the 8th century, no one bothered with coordinates. What's clear is that it was a decisive clash. Rodrigo, with his numerically superior army, should have had the advantage, but internal divisions worked against him. Arab chronicles claim Witiza's supporters, possibly led by Appas, deserted Rodrigo at the critical moment, leaving his flank exposed. Other accounts suggest the Visigothic army, poorly prepared and demoralized, couldn't withstand the Berbers' ferocious charge, driven by a mix of faith, ambition, and the knowledge that retreat wasn't an option. The battle itself was chaos. Medieval armies didn't fight like in movies, with neat formations and elegant choreography. It was a mess of cavalry charges, hand-to-hand combat, and clouds of dust kicked up by thousands of feet and hooves. The Visigoths relied heavily on their heavy cavalry, a Germanic legacy, but this was less effective against a mobile, light enemy like the Berbers, who used guerrilla tactics honed in the Maghreb. Chronicles don't precise on tactics, but Tariq likely exploited the terrain, using hills or rivers for ambushes. When Rodrigo's flanks collapsed, the army's center buckled, and the battle turned into a slaughter. Rodrigo vanished in the battle, and here the story becomes more legend than fact. Some sources claim he died on the field, hacked to pieces or drowned in the Guadalete River while fleeing. Others, more romantic, suggest he escaped and lived as a hermit, an image fitting medieval tragedies but unlikely. Most likely, Rodrigo died in battle, leaving the kingdom leaderless and its nobility in panic. Without a king, and with southern cities in disarray, Visigothic resistance faded like a sandcastle in a storm. After the victory, Tariq didn't linger on the coast. In a move that surprised even Musa, he pushed inland, taking cities like Isija, where he defeated a secondary Visigothic army, and Córdoba, which fell after a brief siege. The capture of Córdoba was particularly significant, as it was one of the south's richest and most populous cities. Chronicles suggest defenders fled or surrendered quickly, possibly because local nobles were more interested in saving their estates than fighting. Toledo, the Visigothic capital, was next. The city, the kingdom's heart, fell almost without resistance. Chronicles hint that Toledo's nobles and clergy, seeing resistance as futile, negotiated surrender, possibly in exchange for retaining privileges. By 712, Tariq had conquered much of the peninsula's south and center, moving with a speed that would impress any modern strategist. But here enters Musa ibn Nusair, unwilling to let his lieutenant claim all the glory. Musa crossed the strait in 712 with a larger army, likely around 18,000 men, and joined the conquest. Arab chronicles say Musa was irked with Tariq for acting without permission, and stories of a public reprimand must have been as awkward as a family spat at a wedding. Despite this, Musa and Tariq worked together to consolidate Muslim control, taking cities like Seville, Merida, and Zaragoza. The conquest wasn't always about swords and blood. Many cities surrendered through negotiated treaties. The Muslims, aware they were a minority in a vast territory, offered generous terms. Christians and Jews could keep their property, practice their faith, and govern under their own laws in exchange for paying the jizya, a tax ensuring protection. This system, known as dhimma, was standard in the Islamic world and allowed conquerors to rule without forcing mass conversions. In the peninsula, this was especially crucial, as Muslims were a tiny fraction of the population. Relative tolerance toward Christians and Jews wasn't just pragmatism. It reflected Umayyad experience in governing multicultural lands. The birth of Al-Andalus, as the Muslim territory in the Iberian Peninsula was called, was more than a military conquest. It was the start of a transformation that touched every aspect of life in the peninsula. Muslims brought a more advanced administrative system than the Visigothic one, based on the Damascus Umayyad model. They introduced new crops like rice, citrus, and saffron, revolutionizing agriculture. They also improved irrigation with techniques from the Islamic world, like acequias, enabling cultivation of previously barren lands. Trade, which had withered under the Visigoths, revived, linking the peninsula to Mediterranean and Islamic trade routes. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Tensions between Arabs and Berbers, who felt like second-class soldiers, surfaced almost immediately. Arabs took most leadership roles and the best lands, while Berbers, who'd done the heavy lifting, got less reward. These divisions would fuel conflicts later. There were also frictions with locals, especially Christians who rejected the new order. Though capitulation treaties offered protection, the jizya was a financial burden, and some northern Christians began organizing resistance. The 711 conquest had a deep impact on the peninsula. In the north, small Christian enclaves, like the one formed in Asturias under Pelayo's leadership, marked the start of what would later be called the Reconquista. But even these kingdoms were influenced by Al-Andalus, adopting elements of its culture from architecture to vocabulary. The peninsula became a melting pot where Christians, Muslims, and Jews coexisted, sometimes peacefully, often in conflict, but always in an exchange that enriched both sides. The conquest's details are full of nuances worth exploring. For instance, Tariq's army wasn't uniform. The Berbers, the majority, came from tribes like the Nafsa, Mazmuda, and Zenata, each with its own traditions and rivalries. Arabs, though fewer, held command roles, creating tensions that would spark later rebellions.
The invasion logistics were another monumental challenge.
Crossing the strait required coordinating ships, supplies, and troops in a context where a single storm could ruin plans. That Tariq not only crossed but advanced so quickly speaks to meticulous planning and, likely, a bit of luck. Another fascinating aspect is how Muslims handled the peninsula's religious diversity. The Visigoths had been intolerant toward Jews, forcing conversion or exile under laws like those of Egica. Muslims, by contrast, adopted relative tolerance, allowing Jews and Christians to practice their faiths as dhimmis. This didn't mean total equality. The jizya was a significant burden, and non-Muslims couldn't hold certain roles, but it enabled coexistence crucial for Al-Andalus's early stability. Jews, in particular, found relief from Visigothic persecution under Muslims, and many thrived as merchants and administrators. The Muslims' military organization also stands out. Unlike the Visigoths, who relied on heavy cavalry and feudal levies, Tariq's army was flexible. Berbers used guerrilla tactics with horse archers and swift attacks that baffled heavier armies. Arabs brought siege warfare experience, key for taking cities like Córdoba and Toledo. Chronicles don't detail weapons, but Muslims likely used curved swords, spears, and composite bows, while Visigoths favored long swords and heavy shields, better for frontal clashes. The role of cities in the conquest is another interesting point too. Visigothic cities like Seville, Merida, and Zaragoza were Roman holdovers with walls, aqueducts, and forums still functioning. albeit poorly. These cities weren't ready for prolonged sieges, and many surrendered after negotiations. Local governors, often bishops or nobles, preferred deals over risking plunder. In cases like Toledo, the Hispano-Roman population didn't always see Muslims as worse than Visigoths, whose rule was often oppressive. As for secondary figures, Count Julian remains an enigma. Some sources say he returned to Ceuta after aiding the invasion. Others, that he stayed in the peninsula as a Muslim ally. His role, though pivotal, fades in chronicles, as if he chose to exit stage left after his big moment. Witiza's sons, per some accounts, received lands and privileges under Muslim rule, suggesting their betrayal paid off. Rodrigo, the defeated king, is the great absent figure. Legends picture him fleeing north, living as a hermit, or even crossing to Africa, but he most likely died at Guadalete, leaving a kingdom that crumbled in months. The conquest of 711 wasn't just a change of flag, it was the birth of a new world. Al-Andalus became a hub of knowledge, with libraries preserving classical texts, scientists advancing mathematics and astronomy, and poets singing of Córdoba's and Granada's beauty. But it was also a place of conflict and where cultural and religious differences fueled tensions that shaped its history. In 711, as Tariq gazed north from Gibraltar, he likely didn't imagine he was starting a chapter that would resonate for centuries. It was a moment of audacity, chaos seized, and a change that forever transformed the Iberian Peninsula.